Henry Kissinger hunched over his desk in the West Wing, the late July heat of 1972 seeping through the walls despite the humming air conditioner. It was past 10 p.m., and the room smelled of stale coffee and cigarette ash. A stack of CIA reports splayed before him, their stark numbers glowing under the desk lamp. India, 550 million and climbing at 2% a year. Nigeria, 60 million, doubling every 2 decades. Brazil, nudging 100 million, slums sprawling. He rubbed his temples, glasses slipping down his nose. The world was swelling, and the U.S. was losing its grip. Vietnam bleeding them dry, OPEC flexing oil muscle, the Soviets lurking at every edge. The door banged open, and Richard Nixon stormed in, tie loose, his jowls flushed from a day of campaign prep. "Henry, we're bleeding out there," he barked, pacing the rug. "Hanoi's a goddamn mess, and now these Arabs think they can choke us on oil. You see the numbers?" He jabbed a finger at the reports. "India's a billion soon, Pakistan too. Too many mouths, not enough food. They'll riot, and we'll pay the price." Kissinger leaned back, voice calm but eyes sharp. "It's worse than that, Mr. President. It's not just riots, it's leverage. The Soviets arm the chaos, and we're begging for scraps." Nixon stopped, glaring. "Scraps? I'll be damned if I let Brezhnev own the Third World. What's the play?" Kissinger tapped the India report. "We choke it at the root, population. Fewer people, less pressure. Security, not sentiment." Nixon grunted, a half-smile flickering. "You're a cold bastard, Henry. I like it." 2 days later, Kissinger summoned General Alexander Haig and a handful of NSC staff to a basement meeting room, its wood-paneled walls soaked in decades of smoke. The table was littered with maps and graphs, red lines spiking across Asia, Africa, Latin America. Haig, square-jawed and crisp in his suit, leaned forward, flipping through a Pentagon brief. "India hits a billion by year 2000. Nigeria's at 150 million. Slums breed radicals. Look at Mao's playbook. We lose bases, we lose minerals, we lose the edge." Kissinger nodded, pacing. "Exactly, Al. It's a domino effect. Brazil's tin, Nigeria's oil, Indonesia's rubber. If they double, we're boxed out. The Soviets don't need to fire a shot, just wait." A young NSC analyst, barely 30, piped up, voice shaky. "But aid food programs, couldn't that stabilize?" "No," Kissinger snapped, cutting him off. "Band-aids don't fix fractures. We need a study, hard data, hard options. Contraception, incentives, whatever works. 13 countries drive half the growth. India, Pakistan, Nigeria, the rest. We target them." Haig smirked. "Sterilize the problem away?" "If it comes to that," Kissinger said, unflinching. "Call it development, shiny hospitals, happy families. They'll eat it up." Nixon's voice crackled through the speakerphone, patched in from San Clemente. "Henry, I want this locked down before 73. Elections in the bag, but Watergate's buzzing. Don't screw me with delays. Security, not charity, got it?" "Got it," Kissinger replied, scribbling notes. "We'll map it 6 months, tops." Haig lit a cigarette, exhaling a plume. "Congress'll howl, imperial meddling. You ready for that?" Kissinger smirked, adjusting his glasses. "Let them howl. They don't see the board." He stayed late that night, drafting the memo in longhand. National Security Study Memorandum 200. Implications of worldwide population growth for U.S. security and overseas interests. The pen scratched, each word a move in a game only he fully grasped. November 1972 found Kissinger and Nixon at Camp David. The air crisp with pine and the election victory still fresh. Nixon sprawled in an armchair by the fireplace, scotch in hand, the Watergate break-in a distant hum he dismissed as opposition noise. Kissinger stood by the window, gazing at the Maryland hills, NSSM 200's rough outline clutched in his hand. "It's done, Dick," he said, turning. "We've got the framework, population as a threat, not a pity case. India doubles, we're begging for rice. Nigeria triples, oil's theirs. We act, or they own us." Nixon swirled his glass, eyes narrowing. "How bad's it get?" "For billion by century's end, maybe 6 if we sit," Kissinger said. "8's the cap, we hold it there, we win. More, and it's not just food, it's power. Bases lost, trade choked, Reds grinning." Nixon grunted, sipping. "Ford's on board." "He will be," Kissinger said. "You sign, I steer." Nixon waved a hand, distracted. "Do it. Keep it quiet, those bleeding hearts'll cry genocide." Haig, lingering by the door, chimed in. "They'll call it imperialism either way, Henry. Third World won't thank us." Kissinger shrugged, folding the outline. Better us than chaos, Al. They'll see it when the riots stop, or they won't. History doesn't care. Nixon drained his scotch, setting the glass down hard. Get it moving. I've got bigger fights. Kissinger nodded, stepping into the night, the memo await in his pocket. The seed was planted, cold, calculated, inevitable. He'd build the machine, and the world would bend or break. April 24, 1974, found Henry Kissinger in his cavernous State Department office, the 7th floor hushed under a spring drizzle pattering the windows. He'd added Secretary of State to his National Security Advisor title 6 months prior, and the dual hats weighed heavy. Vietnam's collapse loomed, the oil embargo bit, and Nixon's Watergate spiral left a void Kissinger filled with relish. He scrawled his signature on a crisp directive, National Security Study Memorandum 200. The ink dried as he leaned back, glasses fogging slightly from a lukewarm coffee. Population wasn't a side issue anymore. It was the board's edge, and he'd hold it. He punched a line on his desk phone to Philander Claxton, U.S. AIDS Director, a wiry technocrat with a penchant for stats. Phil, it's Henry. NSSM 200's live. I need numbers, projections, the works. How fast, how bad? 6 months. Claxton's voice crackled, cautious. Population's a minefield, Henry. Congress will ask questions. Third world won't like it. Then don't tell them, Kissinger said, sharp. Security trumps optics. Get me the data. Claxton sighed. On it. Kissinger hung up, staring at a world map pinned to the wall, red dots blooming across India, Nigeria, Indonesia. The third world wasn't just growing, it was a fuse, and he'd snuff it before it blew. By June, Claxton's team huddled in a U.S. aid basement, fluorescent lights buzzing over stacks of punched cards and typewriter clatter. They pulled UN figures, CIA briefs, World Bank estimates. 13 countries, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nigeria, Mexico, Indonesia, Brazil, the Philippines, Thailand, Egypt, Turkey, Ethiopia, Colombia, drove 47% of global population growth, 80 million new mouths yearly. Claxton scribbled on a legal pad. 4 billion by 2000, 6 billion by 2050 if unchecked. He muttered to an aide. That's a billion more than the planet can feed. Brent Scowcroft, Kissinger's NSC deputy, joined them in July, a lean figure with a pilot's comm, poring over resource maps. Nigeria's oil, 20% of our imports by 80 if they hold steady. Indonesia's tin, Brazil's iron. We lose those, industry stalls. He tapped India's sprawl. 1 billion here, and we're begging for bauxite. Claxton frowned. Food aid's the short fix. PL 480's got surplus. No, Scowcroft said, echoing Kissinger. Short fixes breed long wars. We need births down, permanent. They drafted options. U.S. aid contraception budgets doubled, sterilization camps pitched as health drives. UN Population Fund as a front. Claxton hesitated, scribbling a note. Ethics? Scowcroft caught it, smirked. Tell that to the Soviets when they're drilling our oil. Kissinger summoned them to an NSC war room in August, maps sprawling across an oak table, air thick with tension. Show me, he said, pacing. Claxton slid over a draft, 100 pages of charts, projections, targets. 13 countries, 2.5 billion now, 5 billion by centuries end without us. Contraception, incentives, quietly. No headlines. Claxton pushed back, voice low. India's already twitchy. Aid with strings'll look like blackmail. Then sell it as progress, Kissinger snapped, leaning in. Modern families, shiny clinics, they'll eat it up. Soviets don't care about headlines. We shouldn't either. Scowcroft nodded. 8 billion's the cap. Past that, we're done. This buys us 20 years. Kissinger flipped the draft, eyes gleaming. Good. Flesh it out, December deadline. December 10th, 1974. The final NSSM 200 landed on Kissinger's desk. 200 pages bound in a drab gray cover, its weight thudding against the wood. He sat alone, rain streaking the windows, and cracked it open. Claxton's team had delivered. 13 target countries, fertility rates sliced by 30% via $1 billion in aid over a decade, food leveraged for compliance. He read aloud to an empty room, voice gravelly. Global population held at 8 billion by mid-century, or U.S. security collapses, resources lost, instability rampant. It was cold, surgical, perfect. Scowcroft knocked, stepping in with a bottle of scotch. Done. Done, Kissinger said, pouring 2 glasses. Ford gets it tomorrow. Nixon's gone, but this lives. Claxton had called earlier, uneasy. Henry, India's sterilizations. Rumors are ugly. This could haunt us. Kissinger waved it off, handing Scowcroft a glass. Ethics lose wars, Phil said the same. They'll thank us when the bread lines shrink. Scowcroft clinked his glass, sipping. Ford'll balk. He's softer than Nixon. He'll sign, Kissinger said firm. I'll make him see the board oil, tin power. We're not bleeding for their babies. He drafted a note to Ford, clipped to the report. Mr. President, act now. Our future hangs on it. The blueprint was set, a machine of numbers and will. Kissinger leaned back, scotch burning his throat, the world's edges sharpening in his mind. They'd bend it, or it'd break them. January 15, 1975, cast a pale light over the Oval Office, the snow outside dulling Washington's edges. Gerald Ford sat behind the resolute desk, a stack of briefings dwarfing his coffee mug. At 61, he'd stumbled into the presidency 5 months earlier after Nixon's resignation, a steady hand rattled by inflation and a post-Vietnam funk. Henry Kissinger stood across from him, NSSM 200 tucked under his arm. His dual roles as Secretary of State and National Security Advisor a shadow over the room. Jerry, Kissinger began, voice smooth, this isn't optional. Population's a security bomb. India hits 1 billion, we're begging for rice. Ford flipped the report's cover, squinting at the dense type. 1 billion? Christ, Henry, that's 25 years off. 25 years is tomorrow, Kissinger pressed, pacing. Nigeria triples, oil's gone. Indonesia doubles, rubber's theirs. We lose the third world, we lose the game. Soviets don't need to lift a finger. Ford rubbed his forehead, a linebacker's frame slumping. You're sure this works, contraception, all that? It's math, Kissinger said, tapping the desk. 8 billion's the cap. We hold it, we win. Ford nodded, half convinced, his mind drifting to gas lines and unemployment. Kissinger had him, he always did. Ellen Marshall, a 38-year-old State Department aide, hovered near the door, notepad clutched tight. She'd skimmed NSSM 200 the night before, its clinical tone chilling her. Aid as a lever, births as a threat. She'd joined State to build bridges, not rig scales. But Kissinger's glare kept her silent. A week later, Kissinger briefed Ford's cabinet in the Roosevelt Room, a long table ringed by suits and stale coffee. U.S. aid doubles family planning, $600 million by 76, he said, pointing at a chart, 13 red-dotted countries, fertility curves bending down. UN takes the heat, population funds our mask. Quiet clean. Treasury Secretary Simon frowned. That's a chunk of change, Henry. Congress will squawk. They won't see it, Kissinger shot back. Bury it in aid, development's the sell. Ford, at the head, nodded slowly. Keep it off the front pages. I've got enough fires. Ellen, tasked with cables, drafted one to the Delhi embassy that night. Push contraception quotas, tie food aid to results. Her pen paused. PL 480 wheat for fewer babies felt like blackmail. She whispered to a colleague over beers later. We're bribing them to shrink. This isn't right. Tell Kissinger, the colleague snorted. He'll love that. November 26, 1975, Ford signed NSDM 314 in a quiet Oval Office moment, Kissinger at his elbow. The decision memo greenlit NSSM 200. No Congress, no debate. It's law now, Kissinger said, folding the paper. U.S. aid rolls out, embassies lean in. 8 billion or bust. Ford scratched his signature, voice flat. Hope you're right, Henry. This feels heavy. It is, Kissinger replied, unblinking. Lighter than losing, though. Ellen typed the rollout orders, fingers stiff. She'd seen India's cables, resistance brewing, rumors of forced clinics. She muttered to herself, heavy's one word for it. December 1975, Kissinger hosted India's ambassador, Vijay Gupta, in his state office, a tray of tea steaming between them. The room glowed with forced warmth, Persian rugs, a crackling fire, but Gupta's eyes were cold. Mr. Secretary, he said, your aid's generous, $100 million this year. But the strings, family planning quotas, our people notice. Kissinger smiled, leaning forward. Development needs smaller families, Vijay. Modern nations grow lean. Our clinics help. Surely you see that. Gupta sipped his tea, unmoved. We see pressure, wheat today, scalpels tomorrow. India's not your lab. It's partnership, Kissinger countered, voice silk over steel. Fewer mouths, more bread. You'll thank us. Gupta left, unconvinced, his parting glance a warning. Kissinger shrugged, jotting a note. Push harder, Delhi bends or breaks. Back in the Oval, Ford skimmed a staff memo praising the policy. U.S. aid's budget swelled. UN programs hummed. He barely read it, eyes on a Gallup poll. 38% approval, sinking fast. This better work, Henry, he muttered to an empty room. Kissinger was in New York, charming the UN, untouched by the grumbles filtering up, Pakistan balking, Nigeria stalling. Ellen quit that week, her resignation a single line, personal reasons. Summer 1976 baked Washington, the air thick with humidity and campaign dust. Henry Kissinger sat in his State Department office, a U.S. aid report spread before him like a trophy. India's sterilization camps up 300% since 75, 6 million procedures logged. Nigeria's birth rate dipping, U.S. aid clinics sprouting in Lagos slums. He grinned, adjusting his glasses. 8 billion felt within reach, the NSSM 200 machine humming. The phone rang, Brent Scowcroft, voice clipped. Ford's touting it in Michigan, global leadership. Vague as hell. Good, Kissinger said, leaning back. Vague wins elections. Results win wars. Outside, Gerald Ford stumped in Grand Rapids, a weary figure at 63, voice hoarse over a crowd of 200. We're leading the world, security, progress, he said, NSSM 200 a shadow in his script. Gas prices and Carter's grin loomed larger. He barely noticed the policy's grind. In Delhi, Sanjay Gupta, a 40-year-old Indian official, paced his cramped office, a fan rattling against the monsoon heat. He clutched a cable from Washington. $150 million in food aid, tied to 2 million more sterilizations by 77. They think we're cattle, he spat, tossing it on his desk. India's slums swelled despite the scalpels. NSSM 200's math didn't match the streets. Gupta stormed into India's cabinet room a week later, sweat beading on his brow. Reject their millions, he urged, slamming the cable down. Our future's not for sale, wheat today, our children tomorrow. The room split, some nodded, others balked at losing grain. Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, steely under emergency rule, sided with defiance. No more clinics burned, quiet cuts instead. Protests flared anyway. U.S. aid outposts torched in Uttar Pradesh. Yankee go home scrawled on walls. Gupta watched from his window, jaw tight. They'll pay for this. Kissinger got the news in D.C., a cable from Delhi smoldering on his desk. They'll bend eventually, he told Ford over lunch, a rare Oval Office break. Hunger's a great teacher. Ford nodded, distracted. Carter led by 10 points, November 2nd closing fast. Just keep it off my plate, he muttered, fork pushing peas. Election night came, and Ford lost. Carter swept in, NSSM 200 buried in classified stacks. Kissinger shrugged. $1 billion spent by decade's end, fertility curving down in 13 countries. The machine didn't need him anymore. Ford retreated to California, a footnote by 77, golf clubs replacing briefings. He barely recalled NSDM 314, its weight lost in defeat's haze. Gupta, in Delhi, tracked the slow bleed, births down but poverty up, US aid a bitter pill. They won the numbers, he told an aide, but not the soul. January 20th, 1977, Kissinger stepped down, his last day as secretary shadowed by Carter's inauguration buzz. He penned a final memo in his office, now stripped to bare walls. NSSM 200 secured the board. $8 billion held, U.S. edge intact. He left for a consultancy gig, unapologetic. Years later, at a 1989 gala, NSSM 200 declassified, headlines screaming depopulation plot. He sipped wine, dismissing a reporter. History judges winners. We won. The room clapped, he smirked. Sanjay Gupta read the declassified report in Delhi, its pages yellowing by 89. India hit 750 million, camps faded, but scars lingered, villages hollowed, trust frayed. They reshaped us, he told a journalist, voice low, and called it help. He walked Delhi's streets, kids darting past, a bitter pride settling. The U.S. got its cap. India kept its fight. Ford died in 2006, NSSM 200 a whisper in his obit. Kissinger lived on, a lion at 100 in 2023, memoirs glossing the policy as pragmatism. The world hit 8.2 billion by 2025 per UN counts, close to the cap, but uneven, third world growth slowed, first world wealth swelled. The echoes stretched, aid as a lever, numbers as power, a legacy of control veiled as progress. Kissinger's machine ticked on, its cost etched in Delhi's dust and DC's silence. January 1989 shivered through Washington, the Cold War's end flickering on the horizon. Henry Kissinger, now 65, sat in his Georgetown office, a consultant's lair stacked with books and accolades. The phone buzzed, a New York Times reporter, voice eager. Dr. Kissinger, NSSM 200's declassified. Depopulation plot. They're calling it, your comment. Kissinger chuckled, leaning back, the gray cover of the 1974 report on his desk, its edges worn. History judges winners, he said, clipped. We secured the board. 8 billion held, chaos averted. Call it what you like. He hung up, sipping bourbon, the headlines a distant hum. India's sterilizations, Nigeria's clinics. $1 billion well spent, he thought. The world ticked at 5.2 billion, on track for his cap. In Delhi, Sanjay Gupta, now 53, stood on his balcony, the city's sprawl a haze of dust and honking rickshaws. He'd risen to a senior post in India's foreign ministry, his hair graying, his fight hardened. A junior aide dropped the declassified NSSM 200 on his desk that morning, its pages a gut punch. 13 countries targeted, India's 6 million sterilizations a line item. They reshaped us, he told the aide, voice low, and called it help. Below, kids darted through alleys, fewer than a decade ago, but the slums still swelled, poverty outpacing the math. Gupta flew to a UN conference in Geneva that spring, a panel on population and development. He gripped the podium, facing diplomats and NGOs, his speech blunt. The U.S. leveraged hunger, wheat for our wombs, aid for our souls. We bent, but we didn't break. Murmurs rippled, some nodded, others shifted uncomfortably. A U.S. aid rep countered, smooth. We offered tools, modernization, not control. Gupta's eyes flashed. Tools that scarred us. India hit 750 million by 89, growth slowed, but trust frayed. U.S. clinics shuttered, replaced by local defiance. Kissinger watched the clip on CNN from New York, a gala looming that night. He smirked, scribbling a note for his memoirs. NSSM 200, pragmatism misunderstood. The policy had faded under Carter, then Reagan, but its echo lingered. $2 billion funneled through U.S. aid by 1980, fertility rates down 20% in target countries. He'd left office in '77, but the machine ticked on, UN funds and quiet embassies keeping the cap in sight. Critics screamed genocide. He saw stability, oil flowing, bases secure, Soviets stalled. Back in California, Gerald Ford's death loomed decades off, but in '89 he golfed in Rancho Mirage, a retired footnote at 76. NSSM 200 rarely crossed his mind. Ford's signature on NSDM 314 a blur in '75, drowned by election loss. A reporter once asked, regrets? He shrugged, club in hand. Henry ran that show. Seemed right then. The world didn't notice his silence. May 23, 2023, Kissinger turned 100. A lion at a DC gala, frail but unbowed. He toasted donors, voice raspy. We shaped a century. 8 billion held, America first. The room clapped. Outside, ex-posts raged. Hashtag NSSM 200 trended, old cables resurfacing. The UN pegged 2025 at 8.2 billion, close to the cap, but uneven. India at 1.4 billion, Nigeria 230 million, third world growth curbed, first world wealth ballooned. His memoirs glossed it, a necessary balance. Critics, Human Life International, Oxfam, called it coercion, $10 billion in aid by 2011 on lives. Sanjay, retired in Delhi at 87, watched the gala stream, cane tapping the floor. India's scars faded, camps gone, births steady, but the cost lingered, villages hollowed, distrust deep. They won the numbers, he told a grandson, not the soul. He died in 24, a quiet fighter, his words in Geneva a whisper against Kissinger's roar. The shadow stretched, 2025's world a testament to NSSM 200's cold math. Third world growth slowed, U.S. edges held, but inequality gaped, stability bought with silent wounds. Kissinger's machine, Ford's nod, Gupta's defiance, all echoes in a globe reshaped, its price still tallied in Delhi's dust and DC's gold.